in the home today of author Wanda Evans, the author of Trail of Blood. We just came from a successful book signing at Barnes & Noble. Tell me, what inspired this book, Wanda?
There were two things. One, of course, it was a good story. It was a story of the disappearance of a young man under really brutal circumstances. And I was at the Avalanche Journal in the editorial department when the story broke back in 1991. And I followed that story because they never found his body. They just found a lot of blood in his apartment. And one of the reporters at the AJ, Valerie Avery, had interviewed the young man. The young man was Scott Dunn, had interviewed his father, Jim Dunn, who had come down here from Yardley, Pennsylvania to follow the investigation. And Valerie was very impressed with Mr. Dunn because he was just determined to find out what had happened with his son. So then nothing happened. The police kept investigating, and then things would just sort of die down and you wouldn't hear anything for a while. And then I left the Avalanche Journal, but periodically I'd see a little bit on the news, either the TV channels or in the newspaper, about Mr. Dunn being here and working with the police department, and they still hadn't found out what happened to Scott. Although with the use of forensics and this sort of thing, DNA and what they call reverse DNA testing, they proved that Scott was dead and that, or whoever had died in that apartment was Jim Dunn's son, and they do this through reverse DNA. So that father just caught my heart because I'm a parent myself, and I kept thinking about how I would feel if that happened to my son. And I had a son about the same age and looked sort of like that, and sort of a charismatic young man, blonde, cute, blonde, never saw a stranger, and always looking for a place to get into trouble. And so I kept seeing my son in Scott, and I just identified with that man. So it was a good story, but more than that, it was a story of a father following his heart and his determination to find what happened to his son.
You've been writing for a number of years. Can you tell us more about your experience as a writer?
Oh my goodness, I've done everything. Including, I'll tell you about my very first sale. Back in the late 60s, early 60s, around late 60s, early 70s. I started out, they call me the disaster writer. And I don't think they call me a disaster writer because I was a disaster as a writer. I hope not. But I wondered about that because that's what my friends call me. There were several of us who had started out writing together, and we all wanted to write, but we had not been able to break into freelancing, and that's what we wanted to do. And so we started writing true stories about people who had faced great obstacles and overcome those obstacles. And see, I'm doing the same thing right here with Jim Dunn. But that's what I did. And the first story I ever wrote was about a little baby who was probably not even walking at the time. His mother had put him up on the kitchen counter. She was going to give him a bath in the sink, and there was a box of dishwasher detergent sitting there. He knocked it over on his face. He inhaled it, and he got instant pneumonia. His esophagus was just torn up. He couldn't eat. He nearly died. He had surgery he never learned to talk till he was 5 or 6 years old. Anyway, he almost died as a result of this, and he underwent tremendous trauma with 20 surgeries or something like that, where they had to go all over the United States in order to find the specialist that he needed. And so I wrote the story about little Stevie and sold it to the National Tatler. Well, I sold it to the National Tatler the first time. The thing about writing nonfiction and magazine stories is you can use the same story but rewrite it, slant it differently, and sell it to different markets. But my very first sale was to the National Tavern. And so I wrote several stories like that, and I would sell them 2 or 3 times each. And one of them went first to Reader's Digest. And that was a story of a little boy who was 6 years old who had saved his father's life. I'm still in the disaster mode here, you see. And then I did one for Good Housekeeping that was about a kidnapping that we had here in Lubbock. A banker was kidnapped. Before he was kidnapped, his wife and children were held hostage in his home, and he was taken from his office. He was a banker, and they wanted him to pay a ransom. And so I wrote that story. So that was the kind of thing that I wrote to start with, and I've always been interested in that. And I've always been interested in people, so I did a lot of biography. Of course, what I really wanted was to be the great American novelist, but, you know, that hasn't happened yet. One of these days it's
Are
going
you
to.
working on a fictional piece?
Sort of. I'm almost embarrassed to say that I am because I've been working on it so long, and I haven't written in several months now. But yes, I'm writing on a
Great
novel.
American novel.
Well, you know, they don't do great American novels anymore. They just do novels, and some are successful, and some are fun, and some are serious. And so I'm just writing one that I hope will have, I hope it's going to be humor. That's what I'm working on. We'll see how that works.
Ever regret anything that you've written?
The only regret I have is that I didn't do it better. Everything I've written.
Oh, what about, did you go on and write more true confessions?
No. No, failed that course. I only wrote, I did write 3 or 4. I didn't write the whole 5. I did sell 3. And they were all about children. When I found out that that editor liked children, well, I could turn out the children's story and I could do the confession style. The thing about it is, and you know, a lot of writers don't want to do this because they think their style is their own and they don't want to be influenced by anything else. If you're going to be a magazine writer, you're going to have to write for the style of the magazine. And I hate to say it, but most writers, and we're not talking about the, you know, the big ones like the Stephen Kings and whoever's big, even Stuart Album, or Nicholas Sparks, he's one of my favorites. And they have their own styles, but basically if you're a bread and butter writer and you write books and you're not a bestseller and you're not on all the movies and everything, you have to recognize that book publishers as well as magazine publishers have their own style, and your book is going to be written according to their style. And this doesn't just mean punctuation, but it means the flow of the book and everything. And so they don't go in, you asked me about editors who go in and change it. They don't have time to rewrite your book for you and do that. They'll ask you to do it, and if you can't do it the way they want, then you don't make that sale. And so this is one of the things I learned about. I could learn the style of anybody, just about. It's harder to learn the style for book publishers because you don't sit down writing a book for a specific publisher generally. But when I was doing magazine writing, I did do that. I studied the confessions and I wrote in their style, and I learned to do that. I studied Reader's Digest. When I finally sold that story to Reader's Digest, I was a regular reader of it then, and I had probably 3 years of Reader's Digest, and I wanted it to be a drama in real life, and so I cut out every drama in real life out of those magazines that I thought was anywhere similar to the story that I wanted to write. I tore those stories apart. I read them over and over and over again. I studied the beginnings, I studied the end, I studied how much dialogue, how many words, down to the word, because magazines are very strict about word limits. I just learned to write for Reader's Digest, and that's why I did have to they didn't do any editing, but they did make a couple of suggestions before they accepted it, but while they were still looking at it.
Have you had more than one story published in Reader's Digest?
No, they asked me for some more. I was so thrilled because that story came out in 1977 in Reader's Digest, and it was the most popular drama in real life for the whole year. It was the most popular story for the whole year. It had nothing to do with me because I wrote it strictly to their style.
Have you written anything else for Reader's Digest?
I have written it, they haven't accepted it. Because the story was so popular, they very generously and nicely asked me to submit other material to them. And I did, but nothing just quite fit their needs. Again, I probably wrote 5 or 6 more. The neat thing about it was, once I had written it for them, we're still pretty much in the disaster category, you understand, because that's what drama in real life is. Other magazines, such as Good Housekeeping, were doing that. So if I had a story that was turned down by Reader's Digest, I could redo it a little bit, and it would go to Good Housekeeping, and they would take it.
So you've been published in Good Housekeeping. That's a hard one to get into.
It is a hard one, and I haven't tried in years, so it's probably harder. Now, the styles of magazines have changed so much, and they are so oriented towards celebrity, even Good Housekeeping. So it's really hard for a writer to get in with a story like that.
And I've noticed that when I read Reader's Digest, was it Drama and True Life, it does have a certain format.
It does, absolutely, and you have to follow that format. But you can do that, and I learned Good Housekeeping. I also wrote for Southern Living. I learned to do that.
What are some of the magazines and things you have written?
That was about it. Southern Living, I did, we used to have a magazine called Texas Business, which I wrote for, and then I wrote for some other, like pulp magazine.
And if you were to have a chance to start writing again as a new writer, what would you do differently?
I'd go to school. I would finish school. I would go to a school that specialized in the kind of writing that I wanted to do. For example, Oklahoma, OU has this wonderful reputation for turning out polished writers, published writers, writers who can get their work published, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. And that's what I would do, because I could have been writing books 4 more years than I have. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've been writing for a long time, but I could have written more books had I really known what I was doing, had I had the education to do it and known the shortcuts.
What would you say is there such a thing as formula writing? Because I'm always hearing this, like fiction as well as nonfiction. Mm-hmm. Has there been a change? Because it's so often I feel when you read real life drama, it's almost like it's fiction when you're reading it. Mm-hmm. Is that a technique? Or?
It is a technique. It helps if you know fiction techniques. That's one of the things I learned at the University of Oklahoma. And it's really good to use, because you can use fiction techniques, which basically are emotion, dialogue, stage direction. In other words, how you use your hands when you get up and walk around, whether we look at each other or I look away. Put that in your story, even if it is true. These are some of the things that my editor put in Trail of Blood, because I had forgotten to do that. I knew to do it, but I hadn't done it as much as she wanted. I had done some, but I hadn't done it as much as she wanted. Because this was, not only because it was true, but because it was his book, and I didn't want to do anything that would put him off and say, okay, it didn't happen that way. But yes, that's a very big part of nonfiction as well as fiction.
Okay, so you do need to get into like the main character's mind and
yes. Oh, that's
tell the reader what they're thinking.
What they're thinking, yes.
Because that must be really hard. I guess I'm assuming you, like Mr. Dunn, you interviewed him and talked with him enough you kind of knew what he was thinking.
This is true. I had talked to him on the phone when we decided to do the story. It was the spring, it was the winter, like January of 1999, when I decided I wanted to do this. I had just finished the book, The People's Governor, about Governor Smith, President Smith. And there I was, thinking, what in the world am I going to write? And this story had stayed on my mind, even though Scott had been murdered in 1991. But there were two killers, and the trial of one was in 1997, one in 1998. So it was still fresh at the beginning of 1999, and I thought, I've always wanted to write this story because I wanted to write Jim Dunn's story, but he lived in Pennsylvania. I had no idea how to get in touch with him. I did not know him. I never met him. So I called. I have a friend at the police department. I have a few friends at the police department. I had one friend who was in crimes against people at the police department. His name was John. And I hadn't talked to John in 2 or 3 years, and I didn't know exactly what he was doing up there then, and I didn't know the name of the detective who had covered this case. And so I called John, and I said, John, this is a situation that I'm in. I said, I want to write this story. I would need the cooperation of that detective. And I know it turned out to be Tal English, and I said, and I know I would need permission from somebody to talk to that detective. And he said, yeah, that's right. And I said, okay, can you tell me who to talk to get permission to talk to Tal English? And he said, I can. And I said, okay, who? He said, no, I'm telling you, I can give you permission because I'm in charge of this office now. And so he gave me permission to talk to the detective. And so I talked to the detective and told him what I wanted. And he said, Wanda, I'm going to tell you. He said, I don't know that Mr. Dunn will want this story written. He said, I got to know him really well, and I have all this respect for him. He's a wonderful person. He's a driven person because of what's happened to his son. And because of family situations. He said, I don't know that he'll want this story written. And he said, so I'm not going to give you his telephone number, and I'm not going to give you his address. And I never met Tal English, and one reason he was talking to me is because John told him to, and or suggested that he do so. But he said, I will call him, and I will tell him about you and what you do. And I guess he and John had a talk because he knew what he had good references for me. And he said, I'll call Mr. Dunn, and if he wants to talk to you, he can call me. I'll give him the number. And I said, okay. And so I thought, okay, God, you know me, I'm making agreements with God, partners with God. Okay, God, if Jim Dunn does not call me, this is not the story for me, I'm not going to do it. So a week passed. And I hadn't heard from Jim. And over the weekend, I agonized over this. I thought, this story is really on my mind. I want to write this story. What am I going to do if he doesn't call me? How am I going to find him? Because I'm going to find him and talk to him somehow or another. See, all my good intentions went right down the drain because I just felt compelled to write this story. So I was thinking about it on my way to my office. I had an office over on 50th Street, and I was thinking about it on the way to the office. And I thought, there's got to be a way. I mean, I know his name's James Dunn. He has his own business. I know he lives in Pennsylvania. I can find him. I can track him down, and I can call him if he doesn't call me. I got to the office and just did the regular Monday morning routine, getting ready for work. And the phone rang. It was Jim Dunn. And he was delighted, and he wanted to do it. He talked to Tal, and now I found out later, and I won't go into that, why it had taken him a week to get back to me, because he really wanted to do it. And he had a woman in his office, I think, maybe a secretary or something. He had started his own book, and he had about 70 or 80 pages that had the bare bones of the story down, because what he had done was, for all the years of the investigation, he had talked to everybody remotely connected to that case, remotely connected to Scott, and he had taped the interviews. And so he had given these tapes to this woman that he knew, thinking that she could transcribe them, and he could tell her what he had done, and you can see the chronology of it. And he'd have a book. Well, he had, I think, around 80 pages. And of course, it wasn't a book, but it certainly was a good foundation for the story. So he told me he would send me that. He would send me anything I would need. He would pay whatever expenses I had, because I knew I'd have to have a trial transcript, which is $1,500. I knew I was going to have that. And he told me if I needed to travel anywhere, I could do that. Any long-distance phone calls, whatever, he would do that for me, because he really wanted this book written. So we started doing it, and I read, he sent me what he had, and I read it, and he and I would talk by phone 3 or 4 times a week, and mostly, sometimes we'd do it, he would do it from his office, but he was a very busy businessman, had his own company, CEO of his own company. And so mostly it was at night. He would wait until he got everything done at night. His wife had gone off to bed. Of course, he was in Pennsylvania, so at 11 o'clock there, when she'd gone to bed, he could sit down and relax with the telephone, and he would call me at 10 o'clock, and we would talk for 2 or 3 hours. And this is where I got the emotion that went into the story. This is where I got the motivation for why he was so determined to bring justice for Scott. And we would cry. I was so into that story. I was so into his mind. You would not believe it. And he would talk to me, and I would cry, and the next thing you know, he would be crying. But we got that story put together, and we did it on the telephone. Then we started in January, and then in May, and I still never met him. But in May, my daughter and my grandson and I, Martha and Dusty and I, decided we'd drive to Washington, D.C. And on the way, we'd visit the Civil War battlegrounds. So we started out on this car trip, and I told Jim, I said, I'm going to be out of pocket for a few days because we're going on this road trip. And he said, well, we have a vacation house in North Carolina, so we're probably going to go down there too. And I gave him Martha's cell phone number and told him when we were going. And so the second morning of the trip, we had just turned north after passing Tennessee. I don't even know what state we were in, Virginia, I think. Anyway, we had gone about halfway on our trip, and the cell phone rang, and it was Jim, and he said, I'm in this little town in Virginia. It's on highway, which was 175, I think, which was the highway we were on. And yeah, and he said, and I'm headed to North Carolina, and he said, I'm going to spend the night at this hotel in this little town. And he said, can you meet us there? And we'll have dinner together, and we'll talk with his wife, he and his wife. And so I asked Martha, and she wasn't sure we could make it, but he was closer to it than we were. And she did, and we met, and that was the first time that we met at this little town in Virginia and had dinner together. And then they came out here a few times and we visited, but mostly we did it by phone. And it was a wonderful experience, but we probably spent 10 hours a week together on the phone.
So you really knew him well.
I felt like I did. And I knew Scott well, because he told me all about the way Scott grew up and the things that they did together and the problems that he had, because Scott was dyslexic. And this held him back quite a bit because he couldn't find things that he could do well. And when he finally figured out he could do sound system for cars, he was an expert. He won every prize there was to be given for this. He was just good. He couldn't read. He could not read the schematic. He could look at those wires and tell you exactly what it is. Yeah.
Well, folks, we're at Wanda Evans' home in Lubbock, Texas, talking about Trail of Blood.